In the Dakota Territory, fear had a taste. It tasted like dust and cheap whiskey and the cold iron of a pistol. For Miss Josephine Reed, the town school teacher, it tasted like the shadow of one man, Hiram Apprentice, a man who thought he owned the whole world and every person in it. Every sunset, his shadow fell a little longer over her small schoolhouse, a little darker over her life. She was running from a cage back east, only to find herself in a bigger, deadlier one right here in a place called Redemption Creek. But on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, long after the children had run home, a different kind of shadow filled her doorway. This wasn't the greasy, smiling dread of Hiram Apprentice. This was something older, something bigger. A Lakota man who seemed to block out the sun, a man so large he silenced the ever-present prairie wind just by being there. He didn't knock. He just stepped inside, his eyes holding the weight of centuries. He looked at her, the prim teacher from Philadelphia, and he spoke the words that would either be her salvation or her death sentence. My name is Jacob Blackhorse. I need a wife, and you need protection. Josephine Reed had built her life on the power of words. Words in books, words of philosophy, words that could tame the wild hearts of children on the frontier. She believed in order, in logic, in civilization. But here in Redemption Creek, her words felt like whispers against a hurricane. The only words that mattered were spoken by men like Hiram Apprentice. Apprentice owned everything: the biggest cattle ranch, the saloon where men lost their wages and their dignity, and the freight office that controlled the flow of goods into town. In his mind, he owned the people too. And for months, he'd decided he wanted to own Josephine. It started with polite tips of his hat, then moved to greasy compliments that made her skin crawl. He didn't see a teacher. He saw a shiny new object for his collection. His visits had become a kind of torture. He'd lean in the doorway, blocking her escape, his smile never quite reaching his cold, dead eyes. A woman like you shouldn't be alone out here, he'd said just last week. It's a hard country, needs a firm hand. His hand. He'd offered to build her a new school, a grander one. But the offer came with a price she could feel in her bones. His new school would be on his land. Her current one, the one she owned, sat on the only good water source for miles. He wanted the water, and he wanted her. Her refusal had been polite but firm. His smile had tightened into something ugly. You'll reconsider, he'd said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. He'd left her choking on the smell of a cigar and a fresh wave of fear. Now this new man, this giant, stood where Apprentice had stood. But the fear he inspired was different. It wasn't the slow dread of a spider weaving a web. It was the raw, heart-stopping terror of a lightning strike right outside your window. They called him Mato Ohan, the charging bear, Jacob Blackhorse, a name spoken in hushed tones around town. He was a legend, a ghost from another time. His daughter, a quiet, watchful girl named Lily, was Josephine's best student. Through Lily, she'd learned the barest fragments of his story. His wife had died. He worked a small homestead alone, a piece of land the government gave him to try and turn a warrior into a farmer. He waited until the last child was gone. He waited until she was alone. And then he dropped his bombshell. I need a wife, and you need protection. Her mind, usually so neat and tidy, was a complete mess. I I don't understand, she stammered. Apprentice, he said, the name like a rock in his mouth. He wants your land. He wants you. I see the way he looks. I see the fear in your eyes when he's near. You can't fight him alone. The sheriff works for him. Every word was the cold, hard truth. Sheriff Brody was a pathetic man who collected his bribes from Apprentice with a smile. And you, she managed to ask, her voice a squeak. Why do you need a wife? His gaze flickered to the small bench where Lily sat every day, and his hard face softened for just a second. The government has rules for my land. To keep it, to be seen as civilized. A man needs a family, a proper Christian family. He said the words with a bitterness that told a story all its own. But it's more than that. My daughter, she needs a mother. Her own mother, Tessina, has been gone 2 winters. Lily grows too quiet. She needs a woman's touch. She likes you. She talks about Miss Reed like you hung the moon in the sky. The mention of Lily hit Josephine hard. She pictured the girl's solemn little face, the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes. This would be an arrangement, he continued, his voice a low rumble. A contract. I give you my name, my protection. Apprentice won't dare touch a Lakota's wife. Not because he fears the law, because he fears my people. My rifle is true. No harm will come to you here. In return, you will be a mother to my daughter. You will live in my home, as my wife, in name only. He saw the question in her eyes before she could speak it. I expect nothing more. You would have your own room, your own life. But to the world, to Hiram Apprentice, you would be Mrs. Jacob Blackhorse. It was insane. To marry a stranger, an Indian no less. She'd be an outcast. But what was the alternative? Let Apprentice slowly squeeze the life out of her until she gave in or ran. She'd come west to escape one gilded cage. She wouldn't be forced into another, rustier one. She looked at him. Really looked at him. He wasn't looking at her with Apprentice's hunger. He was looking at her like she was the answer to a problem, just as he was the answer to hers. A partnership for survival. He won't stop, Miss Reed, Jacob said softly, reading her thoughts. Men like him, they take what they want, unless something stronger stands in their way. She turned to the window, looking out at the endless grass. This land had promised her freedom, but it had only delivered a new kind of prison. She thought of Lily's small hand in hers. She thought of Apprentice's leering smile. She weighed the choices. On one side, ruin, fear, and submission. On the other, scandal, uncertainty, and a dangerous alliance. But it was an alliance that offered a shield, a chance. She took a shaky breath and turned back to him. The setting sun framed him in the doorway, turning him into a silhouette of pure, daunting strength. When, she whispered. A flicker of something, relief maybe, crossed his face. The circuit judge comes through on Saturday. We can be married then. Josephine Reed, the proper lady from Philadelphia, nodded her head. She had just agreed to marry a Lakota giant. She had no idea if she'd just saved her life or thrown it away completely. The next 3 days were a blur of whispers and sideways glances. News of the wedding spread through Redemption Creek like a disease. The town mothers who once praised her teaching now looked at her with pity and disgust. To marry a savage, hissed Myrtle Gable, whose son Timmy was in her class. Have you no shame? Josephine's chin went up. His name is Mr. Blackhorse, and his daughter is my finest student. She walked out of the general store, leaving stunned silence behind her. Only the store owner, a kind man named Bogard Finley, gave her a small, secret nod of support. Hiram Apprentice's reaction wasn't whispered. It was violent. He cornered her on her way home Friday evening, his face white with rage. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. This is a pathetic game, Josephine, he spat. You think hiding behind some Indian is going to stop me? Let go of me, she said, her voice shaking but her eyes blazing. You belong to me. This town belongs to me. That school and the water under it belong to me. Then, just like in the schoolhouse, a shadow fell over them. Jacob Blackhorse materialized from the alley beside them. He didn't make a sound, but his presence was a roar of thunder. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Apprentice's hand on her arm. That look was flat, empty, and promised death. Apprentice, who was a bully but not a fighter, snatched his hand back like he'd been burned. This isn't over, Blackhorse, he snarled. Jacob's voice was a low growl. It was over before it began. Apprentice stormed off toward his saloon. Jacob looked at Josephine, his eyes lingering on the red marks on her arm. A muscle in his jaw jumped. Are you all right? Yes, she breathed. Thank you. He just nodded. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. At the preacher's house. And then he melted back into the shadows, leaving her with a racing heart and the terrifying realization that her bargain was now sealed in violence. The wedding itself was a sad, quiet affair. The preacher was so nervous his Adam's apple looked like it was trying to escape his throat. The only witnesses were Bogard Finley, standing by Josephine's side like a silent guard, and Lily, who clutched her father's hand, her big eyes trying to understand the strange words. They said their vows. There was no kiss, just a heavy, awkward silence. Jacob took her elbow, a formal, distant touch, and led her and Lily to his wagon. The journey to his homestead was made in silence, just the creak of the wheels and the lonely sigh of the wind. She was Mrs. Jacob Blackhorse now. The name felt like a costume she hadn't learned how to wear. His home was miles from town, tucked into a small valley. It was beautiful but isolated. The cabin was sturdy, built by his own two hands. It was one large room, spotlessly clean but bare. A stone hearth, a long table, a few shelves. Two areas were curtained off with blankets for sleeping. He pointed to a newly built alcove, also hidden by a blanket. "This will be your room." She looked inside. He'd built a small cot for her. A new, brightly colored quilt was folded at the end. On a small crate beside it sat a single, perfect eagle feather. That small gesture, that little pocket of privacy he had made just for her, was more comforting than any words he could have spoken. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She had a husband, a daughter, a home, but all she really had was a contract with a stranger, and the night was coming. The first few days were an awkward dance of two strangers trying to share a space. Josephine fell into a routine, cooking meals, tending the garden with Lily. The little girl was the bridge between them. Lily started to open up, her silence replaced by questions and laughter. She showed Josephine how to read the clouds, which plants were medicine. Josephine read books to her, stories of faraway lands that made the girl's eyes shine. Jacob would sit nearby, mending tack or cleaning his rifle, his face unreadable, but listening, always listening. The nights were the hardest. Josephine would lie on her cot, separated from him by just a thin blanket, listening to him breathe. He was her husband, but he was a complete mystery, a locked door. Their conversations were only about the farm, or Lily. Nothing personal, nothing real, but the protection he promised was real. One afternoon, two of Apprentice's men rode up to the edge of the property. They just sat on their horses staring at her, their faces smug and ugly. Her heart hammered in her chest. Before she could run, Jacob stepped out of the barn. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. He just stood there, a mountain of a man, and stared them down. The cowboys got nervous, muttered something to each other, and rode away fast. Jacob watched them go, then turned and went back into the barn without a single word. The message had been sent. This land, and the woman on it, were his to protect. The bargain was holding. But as the days turned into weeks, Josephine realized something terrifying. The safety he provided was becoming less important than the man himself. She found herself watching him, intrigued by his quiet strength, the gentleness he showed his daughter, the deep sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. This arrangement was supposed to save her from a monster. She never expected she'd have to save herself from her own heart. The turning point, the moment the fragile truce between them shattered and became something else, came with a summer thunderstorm. It wasn't just a storm, it was a war in the heavens. Lightning tore the sky open, and thunder shook the very foundations of the log cabin. Lily, who normally slept like a stone, cried out in pure terror. Before Josephine could even move, Jacob was there. He was by his daughter's cot in an instant, his massive frame seeming to absorb the fear in the room. Josephine watched from the shadows of her curtained alcove. She saw him kneel and murmur to Lily in the soft, flowing sounds of the Lakota language. He stroked her hair, his huge, calloused hand so impossibly gentle it made Josephine's breath catch in her throat. This wasn't the silent, intimidating stranger she shared a roof with. This was a father, raw and tender, shielding his child from the world's horrors. He stayed until the last rumbles of thunder faded and Lily's breathing was deep and even. When he finally stood, he turned and saw her watching him. The air in the small cabin grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said. She has been afraid of storms since. He started, his voice rough. He stopped, his throat working, and looked out the window into the rain-swept darkness. Since her mother died. It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered her. It felt like a key, tentatively placed in her hand. Josephine knew this was a moment she couldn't let pass. "What was she like?" she asked, her voice soft, stepping out from behind her curtain. He was quiet for so long, she thought he had retreated back into his shell of silence. But then he spoke. Her name was Tassina. It means her shawl. She was like the first wildflower after the snow melts. Strong, but beautiful. She laughed more than anyone I ever knew. He looked down at his own powerful hands. She believed we could make a life here, that we could walk in both worlds. She learned your language, your ways. She wanted Lily to have all the chances she never did. The quiet grief in his voice was a physical thing. Josephine had to ask, what happened to her? A shadow passed over his face, so dark it seemed to suck the light from the lantern. The town doctor said it was a sickness, a fever that came on fast. He paused, and when he spoke again, his words were laced with a chilling certainty. He was wrong. It was not a sickness. It was poison. Josephine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Poison? Who would? 2 winters ago, Jacob's voice turned hard as iron. Apprentices' men were pushing their cattle onto this land, fouling the creek upstream. Tassina told them to move their herd. They laughed at her. A few days later, some of our animals died. Then Tassina got sick. She drank from the creek every day. I was drinking from the well. She was gone in a week. The horror of it washed over Josephine. This wasn't just about land. This was about murder. Jacob's war with Apprentice wasn't a business dispute. It was a blood feud. His need for a wife wasn't just about government rules. It was about protecting the last piece of Tassina he had left. Did you tell the sheriff? A short, harsh laugh escaped his lips. Sheriff Brody, I told him. He called it a tragedy, said there was no proof. Apprentice owns him, owns this whole valley. He finally looked at her, his eyes blazing with a grief and rage he had kept locked away for 2 years. Now you see, this is more than a contract for me. This is about justice for her. In that moment, watching this powerful man lay his broken heart bare, Josephine's last ounce of fear of him vanished. It was replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful, it felt like her own grief. She stepped closer, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Jacob, you are not alone in this fight anymore. He looked down at her, the fierce mask on his face softening as he saw her. Truly saw her, not as a convenience, but as an ally. A few nights later, the roles were reversed. They were sitting by the fire, the silence between them now comfortable, easy. Lily was asleep. Why did you come here, Josephine? He asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. A woman like you from a city like Philadelphia. You don't belong in a place like this. After his confession, she knew she owed him her own truth. She stared into the flames, watching her own ghost dance. I was supposed to be married, she began, to a man named Walter Pierce. His family was very powerful. It was all arranged. To the world he was charming. Everyone said I was the luckiest woman alive. She took a shaky breath. But he wasn't charming. Not in private. He had a temper. A need to control everything. Me. He saw me as another one of his beautiful possessions. His love felt like a cage. She slowly pulled up the sleeve of her dress. In the firelight, a thin, silvery scar gleamed on her forearm. One night, he was angry. He grabbed a letter opener from his desk and he said if I ever defied him, he would mark my face so no other man would ever look at me. I fought him, and he cut my arm. A low, dangerous growl rumbled deep in Jacob's chest. His whole body went rigid with a fury she knew wasn't directed at her. I knew then I could never marry him, she continued, her voice stronger now, empowered by saying the truth aloud. I packed one bag in the middle of the night, and I ran. I bought a train ticket as far west as it would go. I changed my name. I thought I could disappear here, be useful, be free. She gave a small, sad laugh. It seems I have a talent for attracting men who think they can own a woman. She finally looked up and met his gaze. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with a warrior's respect. He reached out, his fingers hovering over her scar for a long moment before gently, tentatively touching it. His touch was a question, a comfort, an acknowledgement of a shared wound. He was a coward, Jacob said, his voice thick with contempt. A weak man. He looked straight into her eyes. You are not weak, Josephine. You fled the cage. That takes a warrior's courage. The last wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer just partners in a contract. They were two survivors, two warriors who had found each other in the dark. Their marriage of convenience had just become something dangerously, terrifyingly real. And in the unforgiving Dakota Territory, anything real was a target. As the first snows of winter began to dust the plains, the cabin became a haven. The awkward silence was replaced by a quiet warmth, the easy rhythm of two people who understood each other without words. Josephine was no longer just a teacher playing a role. She was Lily's mother. She was Jacob's partner. Their arrangement had, against all odds, become a life. But peace on the frontier is as fragile as a frozen leaf. Hiram Apprentice was not a man who forgot a grudge. Humiliated and furious, his obsession with Josephine had festered into a poison. He had money, he had connections, and he had sent men to dig into the past of a schoolteacher named Josephine Reed. It took months, but on the last stagecoach before the heavy snows sealed off the territory, a letter arrived for Apprentice. It contained a name, the name Josephine had tried to bury forever. Walter Pierce. Apprentice chose his moment with the cruelty of a predator. A week before Christmas, during a blizzard so fierce it felt like the world was ending, the howl of the wind masked the sound of horses until they were almost upon the cabin. Jacob was at the window in a flash, his hand already on the rifle above the hearth. "Apprentice," he said, his voice a low growl. "He has 5 men with him, and they aren't here for a friendly visit." Josephine's blood ran cold. She pulled Lily close, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Stay down, sweetheart. Stay away from the window." Apprentice and his men were just a stone's throw away, dark shapes against the swirling white. "Black Horse," Apprentice bellowed, his voice ripped by the wind. "Send her out. Send out the lying runaway you call a wife." Jacob stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. The wind tore at his hair, but he stood like a rock. "This is my land, Apprentice. Leave. Now. I'm not leaving without what's mine." Apprentice screamed back, a mad glee in his eyes. "And she's as good as mine. She's a criminal, a fugitive from justice. I know all about you. Josephine Pierce." He spat her old name like a curse. Watching through a crack in the door, Josephine felt the floor drop out from under her. He had found her. The cage she'd fled had sent its hounds, and they had tracked her all the way here. Apprentice turned his evil grin back to Jacob. "Did you know that, you ignorant savage? Your precious wife is a liar who ran out on a fine, upstanding man? I have a telegram right here from him. There's a reward for her return." He expected the words to be a bomb, to blow their fragile alliance to pieces. He expected Jacob to feel betrayed, used. But Jacob's expression didn't change. His voice when he spoke was calm and clear, cutting through the storm. "Her name is Josephine Blackhorse, and whatever battles she fought to get here only proves she is strong enough to stand with me now." Apprentice's jaw dropped. This was not the reaction he planned for. In that moment of stunned silence, Jacob's eyes locked onto his. "And I know who you are, Apprentice. I know what you did to my first wife, Tassina. I know you poisoned her." The accusation hung in the frozen air, more deadly than any bullet. Apprentice's face contorted with rage. "You can't prove that." "I don't need to prove it to a jury," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I just need to prove it to you." That was all it took. One of Apprentice's men flinched, his hand twitching toward his gun. Jacob's rifle came up in a blur. A single deafening shot cracked through the storm. The man screamed, clutching a shattered shoulder as he toppled from his horse. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Jacob ducked behind the solid log wall of the porch, firing with a calm, deadly precision. Another of Apprentice's men slumped over his horse, which bolted into the white chaos. Inside, Josephine's terror transformed into a cold, hard rage. She was done being a victim. This was her home, her family. She shoved Lily toward the small root cellar hidden under the floorboards. "Stay here, little bird," she whispered fiercely. Don't you make a sound until I come for you." Lily, her eyes wide with fear, but her face set with her father's resolve, nodded and disappeared into the dark. Josephine grabbed the only other weapon in the house, a heavy double-barreled shotgun. Her hands shook, but her purpose was like steel. A bullet splintered the doorframe next to her head. Another shattered the window. Apprentice and his remaining men were dismounting, using their horses as cover to advance. Jacob was pinned down, 3-1. She had to do something. She ran to the back window overlooking the barn. One of the men was trying to circle around to get a clear shot at Jacob's flank. She shoved the window open. The wind blasted her with ice. She rested the heavy shotgun on the sill, aimed for the ground at the man's feet, and pulled both triggers. The roar of the gun was deafening. The recoil slammed her back against the wall. The blast tore up the snow in the side of the barn, sending splinters and ice everywhere. The man screamed in shock and pain, stumbling back as his horse reared and fled. The diversion worked. For a split second, all eyes were on her. It was the second Jacob needed. He moved like lightning. 2 quick shots, another man fell. Now it was just Apprentice and one other. But in that same moment, Apprentice found his mark. A shot rang out. Jacob cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and staggered back against the cabin wall. He slid down, clutching his side, a dark red stain already spreading across the snow. "Jacob!" Josephine screamed. Seeing Jacob fall, Apprentice let out a roar of triumph. "He's hit! It's over! Come on out, Josephine! Time to go home!" He started striding toward the cabin, his pistol raised, his face a mask of victory. But he wasn't walking toward a terrified woman. He was walking toward a cornered Wolverine. Josephine had dropped the empty shotgun. In her hand now was the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. She burst through the door just as Apprentice reached the porch. He looked up, his smile faltering as he saw her charging at him. Not with a gun, but with a piece of cookware, her eyes blazing with a fire hotter than any hell. He was so surprised he didn't even have time to raise his gun. She swung the skillet with all the force of her fear, her rage, and her love. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. Apprentice's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground like a sack of grain. The last gunman, seeing his boss laid out cold and hearing the sound of more riders approaching, Bogard Finley and other townsmen, alerted by the gunfire, threw down his weapon and raised his hands. Silence fell, broken only by the howl of the wind. Josephine scrambled to Jacob's side. He was pale, his breathing shallow, the blood pouring from the wound in his side. "Jacob," she sobbed, tearing a strip from her petticoat and pressing it to the wound. "Hold on. Please, just hold on." He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with pain, but shining with something else. Awe. Love. He reached up a trembling hand and touched her cheek, his thumb smearing a smudge of gunpowder. "My warrior wife," he whispered, and then his eyes closed. The silence after the final gunshot was heavier than the snow that was already starting to cover the ugly scene. When Bogard Finley and the half-dozen men he'd rounded up finally crested the hill, they pulled their horses to a stop, their faces grim. The sight before them was a testament to frontier justice. 2 of Apprentice's men were down for good. Another sat wounded. The great Hiram Apprentice himself was unconscious on the ground. But all their eyes were drawn to the figure slumped against the cabin wall and the woman kneeling in the snow beside him. Josephine was oblivious to the cold, to the men who had just arrived. Her entire world had shrunk to the man bleeding out in front of her. She pressed down on the wound, her face a mask of fierce concentration, whispering his name over and over like a prayer. Sheriff Brody arrived moments later, huffing and red-faced. He took one look at the scene, at Apprentice on the ground, at the dead men, and at the quiet dignity of Josephine fighting for her husband's life. And something inside him, something long buried under fear and bribes, finally snapped. He drew his pistol, but this time he looked like a lawman. "Finley," he commanded, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Get these scoundrels patched up and locked up. The charge is attempted murder." He walked over to Josephine. "Ma'am?" "Mrs. Black Horse," he corrected himself, the name feeling right on his tongue. "We need to get him inside. The doc is on his way. It took 4 men to carry Jacob's massive frame into the cabin. They laid him on his own bed. Lily, brave and silent, emerged from the root cellar and immediately began heating water, a small soldier in the battle for her father's life. The doctor arrived and got to work. The bullet went clean through, he announced, his relief obvious. Missed anything vital by an inch. But he's lost a lot of blood. He's strong, but the fever, the next few days will tell the tale. And so the long vigil began. The world outside the cabin disappeared for Josephine. Her life became a cycle of boiling bandages, spooning broth between Jacob's lips, wiping the sweat from his brow, and sitting in the dark, watching, praying for his chest to keep rising and falling. She had never known a tiredness so deep it ached in her bones, yet she had never felt so alive. This man was no longer a stranger, no longer a contract. He was Jacob, the man who had seen the warrior in her. The thought of losing him was a physical pain, a terror worse than anything a Prentice had ever made her feel. Lily was her silent partner in the vigil. The bond between them, forged in fear, now solidified into love. They were a family fighting for their center to hold. Jacob tossed and turned in the grip of the fever. In his delirium, he spoke in Lakota. Josephine couldn't understand the words, but she heard the name. Tessina. He was saying goodbye to his past, to the wife who had been stolen from him. Josephine felt no jealousy, only a deep sorrow for his loss. Then on the second night, something changed. His restless murmurs shifted. A new name surfaced from the depths of his fevered dreams. Josephine. He whispered it like a prayer. Josephine. Stay! Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took his large, hot hand in both of hers. I'm here, Jacob, she whispered, tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally falling. I'm not going anywhere. On the third morning, the fever broke. She awoke in the chair beside his bed to find his breathing was even, his skin cool. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. And for the first time in days, his eyes were clear, and they were focused only on her. Josephine, he whispered, his voice a rough rasp. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips. Jacob, you're back. He tried to sit up, wincing. She was there in an instant, gently pushing him back down. Rest. You have to rest. A slow, faint smile touched his lips, a sight more beautiful to her than any sunrise. You saved me, he said, with a skillet. A watery laugh bubbled up from deep inside her. It was the heaviest thing I could find, she confessed. I was so angry. I know, he said, his gaze holding hers. My warrior wife. The words landed in her heart, erasing the last remnants of their business arrangement. This was real. This was their truth. He slowly lifted his hand and cupped her cheek. She leaned into his touch, a touch that was no longer just a comfort, but a claim. A home. My husband, she answered, her voice trembling, and she leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. A promise sealed in the quiet cabin, a bond forged in blood and fire. As Jacob healed, so did Redemption Creek. Bogard Finley brought news. With Apprentice in chains and his hired guns talking to save their own skins, his empire of fear crumbled. The story of what happened at the Black Horse homestead became a local legend. The quiet school teacher and the Lakota warrior who had stood against a tyrant and won. They hadn't just saved themselves. They had liberated the town. By the time the spring thaw came, Jacob was back on his feet. The angry scar on his side was the only reminder of the battle. Inside the cabin, the careful distance they had once maintained was gone, replaced by the easy intimacy of a shared life, filled with the one thing that had been missing for so long: laughter. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, the three of them stood on a small hill overlooking their home. Lily danced through the new grass, chasing insects, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Jacob came up behind Josephine, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She had come west to disappear, to escape. Instead, she had been found. She had built a new life, not on the ashes of her old one, but on a foundation of courage, respect, and a love she never could have imagined. It's beautiful, she sighed, looking out at the endless prairie. Yes, Jacob agreed, his voice a low rumble against her ear. But he wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at her. It is. The future was still the frontier, vast and unknown. But they would face it together, a family, whole and unbroken, standing strong in a town they had redeemed. The story of Josephine Reed and Jacob Blackhorse is a powerful reminder that family isn't always something you're born into. Sometimes it's forged in fire and crisis. It's about two people from different worlds, both scarred by their pasts, who found in each other not just a shield against the darkness, but a love that was stronger than any evil. Their alliance, which started as a desperate bargain, became a testament to the fact that the greatest strength is found not in fighting for yourself, but in protecting the ones you love. If this story of courage, resilience, and unexpected love in the harsh Dakota Territory moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a story of true grit. For more historical tales that bring the past to life with all its danger and drama, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.